Hello there. Welcome to the first of the training tasters that root6 is doing at BVE this year. These are little sort of half-hour, 45-minute tasters of our day-long training courses. So if you're in the market for getting some engineering training, then this will give you a flavour of the kind of thing we do, often at our premises in Soho, or indeed at broadcasters' premises. And if you've got a lot of students, we can come to you and tailor the training to suit your needs. As I say, it's engineering training, so if you've kind of come in thinking that it's going to be about production or something, then it is going to be about bit rates and raster sizes and things like that. So if you want to kind of scoot off now because it's very boring, then feel free to. But if not, then you're very welcome to stay. And as I say, we'll be spending about half an hour, 45 minutes going over what we've got up there. 101 digital media, the size, the shape, and the frame rates. Basically, why digital media is the way it is as we find it now, and how it relates to history, where things have all come from, and what as a jobbing engineer or a jobbing technical operator or an edit assistant you can expect to find at your broadcast facility or the editing facility, the post house where you might be working. So as we go through this presentation, we'll be looking at history. What does video look like, and why does it look the way it is? Computer graphic formats, MPEG, which is a very pervasive set of codecs and methods of encoding, and editing and transmission codecs, how they differ and how you have to be aware of that as you work in television, all the way through to contemporary MPEG-4 type codecs. You might have heard that expression, MPEG-4, sort of current state of the art as far as video encoding goes. And then really one thing that's kind of out on its own, and it's really included because people ask this a lot, 23.976 frames per second. What's that all about, and why do we need it? So we'll go over that a little bit. And then if there's any burning questions, we'll have the obligatory Q&A at the end. There we go. So there's something that may be familiar to you, a waveform monitor, a piece of television test equipment. And until 10 years ago, that was the only thing that engineers ever looked at. If you were checking material back for transmission or for delivery or anything of that nature, that's the piece of equipment that you'd be checking it with. And it really reveals to us where videos come from and the nature of it, because what you're looking at there is an analog waveform. It's nothing to do with digital at all. Right up until the 1970s, when television looked very much like it looks now, studio shows, outside broadcasts, sports, news, that kind of thing, there was no digital video and there was no pixels, and video was entirely an analog business. Everything from the monochrome video level, which if you're familiar with this kind of test equipment, is the height of the signal that you're looking at there, through to the color content, which again, if you're familiar, is the kind of mushy extra bits that are added on top of the video signal, and even all the synchronizing information, that was all encoded in an analog manner and put onto a single video signal on a single piece of cable. And that was true of cameras, of videotape, of telecine, and any device that you might find in a television facility or a broadcaster of the period. But come the mid-70s, everything started to change, and the three things that really ushered in sort of seminal early digital video were time-based correction, synchronization, and standards conversion, which we'll have a quick look at because it does bear some relevance. Time-based correction. If you've ever seen anything like that, that's a very old-fashioned video recorder. That's a 1-inch machine, which, until probably 20 years ago, was the mainstay of television production. All television programs are made on 1-inch machines, and it kept a lot of engineers in jobs because they were notoriously difficult to repair and they broke down a lot, and it was a thing of its time. But the thing about an analog videotape recorder like that, be it an open reel machine, a 1-inch machine, or a U-matic machine like you still occasionally see in advertising agencies, was that the video signal that comes off the videotape inside is not a particularly stable signal. It oscillates around in a way that you don't get out of a television camera. And if you want to do anything with that signal, like play it into a studio and mix it with a live camera, or the numerous other things you might want to do with a video signal, you have to stabilize it and lock it to your super stable station Genlock black and burst reference source, and that's done with a piece of equipment called a time-based corrector. And the way a time-based corrector works is that it turns the video signal into a digital representation of the video signal, stores it in a computer store, and then reads it out at that constant, super stable, locked clock rate. And in fact, in that machine there, the big cupboard of electronics underneath the tape transport is the time-based corrector. And back in the mid-70s, that's what you needed to do 8 lines of digital video, let alone a frame of digital video. That's just 8 lines. But it did what it did, and it was just fine. Synchronization was another thing that started to rear its head in the mid-70s. There's a photo from the 1976 Montreal Olympic Games, and that was the first Olympic Games where helicopters were used for dramatic aerial shots. It was the first Olympic Games where lots of widely dispersed cameras were used, where the quality and the stability of the signal coming back from the camera couldn't be guaranteed. And so, as a kind of step on from time-based correctors that we mentioned on the previous slide, you need a piece of equipment called a synchronizer, which can take a whole frame of video, digitize it, store it in that computer store, and read it out again at the timing signal that you require, that super solid Genlock signal. And in the mid-70s, there were only a few players in this game, and the Quantel DFS 3000 was the first, and it basically opened up producers to allow them to do those kinds of things. It allowed them to have cameras hanging off helicopters, which previously to that was very hard or impossible. You may still see the effect of synchronizers on television nowadays. If you ever watch things like the Tour de France or the motorcycle racing, where they typically have a camera on the back of a following bike, occasionally you'll see that camera freeze, and that's because the feed from the camera has been lost. The radio link back to the OB truck has been lost, and the synchronizer, the gadget that locks that picture ready for use in the OB, has frozen the signal, and that's the effect of having a synchronizer in the circuit. Now, this really all kind of culminates in this process called standards conversion. You may or may not be aware that in different parts of the world we use different television standards. Now, we're still in the standard definition days, so HD isn't really upon us yet. But in Europe and other parts of the world, we use a system called PAL, which has 625 lines making up a full TV picture, 25 frames per second. And those frames are broken down into 2 interlaced fields, which is a little technical detail, which we can talk about later if you like. In the Americas, and countries where America was the influence, NTSC was the system used, which was 30 interlaced frames per second and only 525 lines. So slightly different, but very much kind of similar ideas of analog video. And it turns out that to convert between those 2 signal standards, to go from your 625 lines of PAL at 25 frames per second to 525 lines at 30 frames per second, you need about 8 frames of storage. If you want to do a good job of making PAL video look good to the NTSC viewers, or the other way around, you need about 8 frames of storage to make that happen. And so you can see that these 3 early applications of digital video, time-based correction, frame store synchronizer, and standards converters, have gone from requiring about 8 lines of video, just a tiny little portion of the video frame, to a whole frame of video, to 8 frames of video. So you can see that at the time, digital video was advancing, but all of these machines, they were all connected to each other over the analog video interface, over a composite PAL with a single piece of video cable. And the fact that the video was digital inside those machines, and wonderful things were happening, signal standards were being converted, that didn't really matter, because externally it was all analog video, machine to machine. And it wasn't really until the late 80s, mid to late 80s, that digital video recorders started coming along, and manufacturers thought, we can really kind of do something clever here. If we could move the video from our digital video effects machine onto videotape entirely digitally and then back off again, there's no limit to the amount of processing we can do. There's no limit to the amount of effects we can apply to that video before it starts degrading and looking like it's been through several generations of analog videotape. And so in the late 80s, you started to find equipment that had digital video connectors on the back of it. The D1 digital video recorders from Sony, and lots of other pieces of equipment using the seminal 601 system, which had been around for a few years at that point, but hadn't really been adopted. Now, at this point, it's probably worth mentioning a little bit about what CCIR Rec 601 video is all about. You may well hear that expression. 601 video is now really the sort of the expression that means standard definition. That's what most people mean when they say 601 video, and by extension 709 is the standard that we refer to high definition video. But there are some of the characteristics of 601 video, and when you look at it, you realise that it's anchored very much in the 1980s. It's 4:3. So it's not like a widescreen display like this monitor here or this monitor here or the television you've got at home. It's 4:3, like an old glass tube CRT monitor. The resolution is 720 pixels along the horizontal by 576 lines down the vertical, and that's enough pixels in a frame of video to faithfully represent what standard definition video looks like. You know, that high quality video coming out of your television camera, that will encompass it perfectly. And it uses a color encoding system referred to as YCBCR, which essentially stores a full resolution monochrome picture and then a couple of helper signals that allow the receiving piece of equipment, be that a monitor or a television or whatever, to paint in the color on top of the higher resolution monochrome picture. And in fact, the two color difference signals, as they're referred to, the CB and the CR, if you're using that nomenclature, and in fact lots of engineers erroneously refer to it as a YUV. It's very similar but not quite the same. You've got a full resolution luminance signal and two half resolution chrominance signals, the color difference signals. And that's just because of the way your eye works. Your eye is a lot less sensitive to color changes than it is to changes in light level. And so 601 was fantastic. You know, from the mid to late 80s all the way through until about 3 years ago, it just served us perfectly. I mean, it got extended a tiny bit to cover things like 16:9, but as a signal standard, it was robust and solid, and pretty much everything we did in television with digital video until very, very recently was done, you know, because of the 601 standard. Now, the little point I make just there is that when we went from 4:3 to 16:9, we went from a format that had almost square pixels, but not quite, to non-square pixels, very definitely non-square pixels. So just bear that in mind, because that's important when you're then considering computer graphics formats. 601 was fantastic because it allowed television to do lots of things it hadn't done before. It allowed very effects-heavy editing, even on tape. But 601 is unlike most computer graphics formats. The color space, that YCRCB, CBCR as it's written there, the fact that they're non-square pixels, and the size of the frame is unlike most computer graphic file formats. You know, if you're working with Photoshop and you're taking frames off your digital stills camera, they don't look like Rec 601 digital video frames. Pretty much everything's wrong. The color space is wrong. Most computer graphics formats use RGB, the red, the green, and the blue components. They assume square pixels, and their frame rates are variable. So you know, the pictures that come off your digital camera will be many thousands of pixels across the top and many thousand down the side, unlike 601. But again, getting back to 601, at this point, Photoshop hadn't even been invented, and none of us were really, you know, grabbing stills off our camera and emailing them to people and doing all that kind of stuff. This is very much in the pre-domestic computer graphics days. So at this point, it's worth expanding on a word you may have heard, the word codec, and you may or may not know what that means and be familiar with it. But think about whereas before we were thinking about analog video, now we're thinking about digital video. If you think about standard definition digital video, the data rate, i.e. how many tiny bits of data you need per second to faithfully represent that signal, is about 270 megabits per second. 270 million digital bits of information per second just to get a standard definition picture down a piece of cable or into a monitor or onto a videotape machine. I mean, high def comes in at even much higher data rate than that, about 1.5 gigabits per second, which is a phenomenal amount of data. And in fact, contemporary digital video standards are actually 3 gigabits per second. So you can see that that's just a vast amount of data. And in fact, those data rates are far too high to be recorded onto videotape or to be sent over a computer network. And so something has to be done. The payload, the physical size of that data has to be reduced. And so from very early on in the days of digital video, going back to the 1980s, people started devising mathematical ways of crunching that data down to much smaller, much more manageable sizes. And that mathematical transform that takes what is essentially numbers representing pixels and turns those into a description that allows the receiving piece of equipment to reconstruct the pixels, that's called a codec. It's short for code and decode. That's the mathematical technique that takes those huge, great 270 megabits in standard definition or 1.5 or 3 gigabits in high definition and crunches them down into a data stream that's much easier to manage, much easier to handle. And it's no longer a bunch of numbers representing pixels, i.e. the light and dark points on the screen. It's now a mathematical description of how we're going to get back to those pixels. And depending on the application and the kind of codec you use, compression rates of 10 to 10% of original space, or even much better, are possible. And there are different codecs, and they all have pros and cons. And some codecs are better suited to shooting material. So the EX3 camera you might be using to shoot on set, on location, that shoots onto its memory card using a certain codec. The editor in his Avid suite or his Final Cut Pro suite, he'll be editing using another codec, which again is suited to his needs. And then when that material gets passed onto the transmission facility and gets copied onto the transmission server, again, another different kind of codec will be used. And even when that material is then multiplexed up with lots of other channels and put onto the Freeview transmitter or sent up to the Sky satellite, again, other codecs will be used, which are ideally suited to the application. So that's codecs. That's, so in your mind now you've got this idea that we have mathematical models, mathematical functions that are applied to this huge bulk of video data, and it turns it into a much smaller, much easier to handle stream of information. So now if we think about early computer graphics formats, and we've had video on computers for quite a long time. If you remember QuickTime version 1 back in the early 90s, that could display a low quality postage stamp video on your computer display, and that kind of worked. And then all through the 90s we started to see better and better interactive CD-ROMs and all that kind of stuff, video on your computer screen. But again, in the same way that early graphics formats really bore no relation to what the format of a television signal looked like, all these early computer video formats, they bear little relation to how we'd like video to look like in television. So we'll get onto MPEG in a minute, because MPEG is kind of a special case. But again, early computer formats, and there's a picture of a QuickTime player, and QuickTime really was very early computer video. Square pixels, which again isn't very television, RGB for their color space representation, and varying frame rates. Typically early QuickTime would do 12 frames per second, 15 frames per second. Not the kind of thing we want to see for nice, smooth sports coverage. If you turned on the television and you watched a football match at 12 frames per second, you'd be very disappointed. So again, there's not yet been this convergence of computer video with what we in television would regard as digital video. And again, we'll mention just a tiny bit more about different file formats that are used on computer. TIFFs, TARGAs, bitmap files. Again, all those things are different with respect to video. And so we've got to ask the question, how on earth has this been reconciled? In fact, has it been reconciled? How is it that we're now using domestic computers to edit all our television? How is it that where you walk into a transmission suite and the transmission server might be running Microsoft Windows, or it might be running Linux. It's running a computer operating system. So here we've got a little bit of an explanation of what really, I suppose, was the kind of saviour of television and digital video and computerised video formats, and that's the Motion Picture Expert Group. They're a very clever bunch of chaps out of Dusseldorf in Germany, and they've essentially devised codecs from very early on, from the early 90s, that have allowed proper television to be done on computers. MPEG-1, which, as it says there, 1993, which was the basis of some early domestic disc playback systems. You might remember CDI and Video CD, which were kind of early DVD type machines, but they were very much aimed at the domestic market. Very, very low resolution video, very low data rate, kind of akin to VHS quality, but it was starting to move towards computer video formats that looked like the kind of video we deal with in television. MPEG-2, 1995, and that really kind of gets things going. That really brings computerized video formats into the domain of what we can use in television. So much so that pretty much everything standard definition in television is done MPEG-2, whether it's your transmission server, whether it's your Freeview stream being delivered to your house. They're all going over MPEG-2 type codecs. DVD as well. DVD is entirely based on MPEG-2, and as we can see there, 601 resolution. So we're starting to get towards television, type standards. It uses YCRCB as its color sampling system. It supports 16:9 or 4:3 non-square pixel video. Surround sound audio. That was, had never really been considered with computer formats before that. And it also tolerates multiple frame rates, so 23.976, 25, 29.97 for NTSC, and there's a little phrase we'll dig into in a while: long op or iframe. So the codec will tolerate being used as a transmission codec, a delivery codec, if you will, or an editing codec. And then come the late 90s, things get really exciting with MPEG-4. Nobody knows what happened to MPEG-3. Maybe 3 is an unlucky number somewhere, but MPEG-4 is really the basis of all modern television codecs. Whether you're shooting on a camera, editing or delivering, you're probably nowadays using an MPEG-4 codec. So this next slide is a bit of a horror. A bit of a complicated one, and by all means look away and maybe just go over it again when you download the notes later on. But we talked a bit about codecs, the way you can use a mathematical model to transform that huge, great data stream of digital video into a more manageable stream of data, a lower data rate stream of data, and in fact, modern video compression systems do this in one of two ways. They'll take a still frame of video and they'll analyze it for all the bits that can be left out. So if you've got a huge great swathe of blue sky, there's no point in encoding that as many pixels of blue. There's quite clever mathematical functions that can say, actually, we can describe that big block of sky. Similarly, if you've just got a locked off shot, imagine a locked off shot of a newsreader doing his piece to camera. What changes in that shot? Well, his head moves about a bit and his lips move about, and maybe occasionally somebody walks past in the background. But pretty much all that video frame remains constant, particularly if the cameraman's locked off the camera. And so consequently, you can get away with sending not very much on subsequent frames. You have to have these things called iframes, where you send the complete, I say the complete, but the complete compressed frame, the compression having been applied to the single frame of video. But then subsequent frames, you can say, well, what changed? And in fact, you can go even cleverer than that. You can say, not only what changed, but what changed and how did I get it wrong? So you end up with this structure of not sending a complete video frame, a complete video frame, a complete video frame. You send a complete video frame, referred to as the iframe in this diagram, and then periodically you send some other frames called p-frames, which are predictive frames, and they basically say what's changed at a very simple level, and then between the p-frames and the i-frames you send these things called b-frames, bidirectional predictive frames, and they say what did we get wrong when we made the predictive frame. Now, it all sounds very convoluted, but what you wind up with is rather than this huge, great data load of uncompressed video frames, you wind up with a very, very slimmed down format where, you might only be sending, 5% of the original data rate, and you still get pictures at the other end that look as good. I'm not going to really sort of dwell on that much more, other than to say that the takeaway is that for editing codecs, you need the iframes, they're important, but for transmission, delivery, DVD type authoring codecs, you can get away with this long GOP, as it's called, long group of pictures, where you're exploiting not only the fact that there's very little changing in each frame of video, but there's actually very little changing between the frames of video as well. And that's kind of summarized there. You might have heard editing codecs referred to as iframe only codecs or short GOP codecs. And the way they work is the editing codec will only do iframes. So regardless of where you park your Avid's playback, you can always build a complete frame of video from that iframe. You don't have to go looking either side to say, oh, I've landed on a B frame, I need to get some data either side of where I am to be able to build the frame, because, hey, you might have made an edit at that point, and that gets very complicated. So iframe-only codecs, or short GOP codecs, as they're sometimes referred to as, they're ideal for editing. But for transmission, where you're just sending a stream of video to the viewer at home, you can get away with a long GOP codec. You can get away with not only exploiting the fact that there's very little changing in each frame of video, but there's also very little changing between the frames of video. And this gives rise to what they call a rule of 5 that engineers sometimes refer to. So again, we're still thinking about standard definition video for these figures to work, but uncompressed standard definition video, if we forget about the audio component, is about 250 megabits per second, 250 million digital pieces of information per second to make that system work, to get pictures at the other end. But if you compress that down using the MPEG-2 system to an editing type codec, 50 megabits per second gives you pictures that perceivably are pretty much the same as the ones you started out with, and lots of places do that. Lots of places, Channel 5, and that's a prime example, all their editing is done at 50 megabits per second, and that's very standard throughout the industry at standard definition. Now, if you then say, well, our program's finished, here's our completed piece of material, this can be prepared and put on the transmission server, you can now really go to town and use a long GOP codec. You can exploit all that redundancy between the frames of video. You can not only just have iframes, but now you can have the P frames and the B frames, which allow you to squeeze that video down a bit more. And in fact, typically, if you walk into the transmission department of most modern broadcasters, 10 megabits per second is not unusual for the data rate they're playing out of their transmission server. And in fact, by the time that material's gone through what they call a statistical multiplexer and turned into a DVB or a satellite stream for the home, 2 megabits per second is not unusual. So again, every time you exploit a bit more redundancy in the video, you can compress it down another 5-fold, and it pretty much still looks good, So that's really kind of, I suppose, the state of the art until about 5 or 10 years ago with standard definition video. But of course, we live in an HD world now. Everything is commissioned and shot and delivered in HD, and of course, with that, we had to have better codecs. We had to have better systems for compressing that video down and giving us a bit more bangs for our buck. Typically, we'd like to be able to transmit HD over similar kind of data rates as we did to SD, but of course we've got 6 times as many pixels now. It's 6 times as much resolution, and it really has to be a lot better. So HD video, whereas we were talking about the 601 standard for standard definition video, the 709 standard is now what we refer to when we talk about high definition video. And as you know, 1920 by 1080 is the very typical high resolution frame size that we transmit. And 16 by 9 is all we have now. Nobody watches high definition on 4 by 3 televisions. And And the rather splendid thing is that now we've kind of got a video format that has square pixels. So, when you're going between Photoshop and Avid, you don't have to worry about resizing things to make sure the pixels are the right size. And additionally, with HD video, we've now got access to a lot more frame rates. So, a movie's made in 25 frames per second, in 24 frames per second for the cinema. It would be quite nice to be able to transmit it at the rate it was made. And so HD standards, encompass and support all those other frame rates, 24 frames per second, and the elusive 23.976, which we'll come to, and why that's necessary. MPEG-4, as I've mentioned, is the basis for acquisition, editing, transmission codecs currently, and MPEG-4 does a few things to improve on the compression ability that MPEG-2 brought to the party. So MPEG-4 does this thing whereby, whereas MPEG-2 would consider a frame of video and it would chop it up into well-defined block sizes, typically 8x8 or 16x16 pixels, and it would start doing its work on those, what they call macro blocks. And in fact, you'll have noticed that if you have a high-speed spinner digibeta tape, as the machine spins the tape off, you'll notice that the picture's very blocky. Or if you've been watching television at home and there's a rainstorm and the quality of your reception goes down, you might notice blockiness on your digital reception at home if you're watching Freeview. And what that reveals to you is the picture has been chopped up into these macro blocks, and the compression system is doing its magic, it's working its thing across these macro blocks. Now, the very clever improvement that MPEG-4 brought to video compression was that it allowed variable size macro blocks. It allowed macro blocks to be bigger or smaller. And if you think about it, that's exactly what you want with a video codec. You want the compression system to be able to really work hard when there's lots of detail in a picture, like around a very detailed edge of an object. You want the compression to be able to really kind of apply itself there. And for huge great swathes of the picture where there's not much going on, you want the codec to have the option of using very large macro blocks. And that's what gives MPEG-4 its power. It has variable size macro blocks. And in fact, MPEG-4 hasn't stayed still as a system. It's been developed and manufacturers and standards bodies have extended it. And MPEG-4 Part 10 is the system we find ourselves with today, sometimes referred to as H.264 or AVC. And that further improves on the power of MPEG-4 by allowing macro blocks to be referenced across those iframe boundaries. So if you remember our image of the group of pictures, where we have an iframe, a couple of B frames, a P frame, in the past with MPEG-2, and in fact with just plain old vanilla MPEG-4, every iframe had to re-establish every macro block. Every iframe had to say, here is a complete new frame of video, and we're kind of off and going again. Whereas with MPEG-4 Part 10, H.264, that's allowed to say, actually, this macro block on this frame is exactly the same as that one from 5 seconds ago. And that's crossed many, many iframe boundaries, and it's referred in video terms, so 5 seconds, it's not a long time, but in video terms, it's years ago. It's referred to things that happened a long, long time ago. So you can imagine that same newsreader doing his piece to camera, not much changing. MPEG-4 Part 10 H.264 now allows the codec to say, there's stuff in this picture that hasn't changed for many, many seconds, and we don't have to resend it. So here's a little graph here, which sort of reveals the perceptual differences of those different compression systems. The pink line, the one going across the top there, is AVC, MPEG-4 Part 10. The one in the middle with the with the diamond dots on it, which is kind of black from where I'm standing, is MPEG-4, just plain old vanilla MPEG-4, and the bottommost line, which is kind of a green colour from where I'm standing. But anyway, the one with crosses on is old-fashioned MPEG-2, good old MPEG-2 from the 90s. And this diagram shows us sort of perceived picture quality along the y-axis, going up the vertical there. And along the horizontal, we've got bit rate, which is how much data is required to send this encoded video. And what that shows us is, for similar bit rates, we get much better perceived quality. So if where you can see there's a line going up just after 2,000 kilobits per second, so 2 megabits per second, and it intersects the MPEG-2 line at about 26 dBs, and it intersects the MPEG-4 line at about 29 dBs, and it intersects the MPEG-4 Part 10, the AVC line, at about 32 dBs. So what this is telling us that is, for the same video encoded at the same resolution using those 3 different codecs, we get appreciably better picture quality for the same data rate. And in fact, what's more important in television is that for the same picture quality, we can get away with much lower data rates. So if we follow, say, the 26 dBs PSNR figure, the line going across horizontally, we can see it intersects the AVC line at about 800 kilobits per second. It intersects the MPEG-4 line at just over a megabit per second, and it intersects the MPEG-2 line at kind of 2 and a bit megabits per second. So for the same data rate, using AVC, a modern H.264 type codec, we can get away with probably a third of the data rate that would be required if we were still relying on MPEG-2. So I suppose the whole point of this sort of constant evolution and development of video codecs is that it allows them to stick more channels on an Astra satellite or more channels on a Freeview multiplex, which, given that it's all about the advertising revenue and getting television to people's homes, is a good thing. So that diagram, although it's equally applicable to editing type codecs, the data rates we saw there were very typical of the kind of data rates you'd get if you were transmitting into the home over Freeview or over Sky. But now we'll turn our attention to sort of 2 words that you may have heard which often get confused and are important to kind of appreciate the difference between. We've mentioned codecs, and as a little recap, a codec is that mathematical function that turns that very high data rate video signal, all those pixels, into a description of how to get back to the pixels, and by doing that shrinks down the data rate of the video stream considerably. But you might also have heard the word container format. Now, I've got a few video formats up there. Avid DNX HD, which is Avid's current high definition editing format. It's an iframe format, as you'd expect from the fact that it's an editing codec, and that's a codec. QuickTime, that's a wrapper format. That's a way of delivering video, and the wrapper can contain several codecs. You could have a QuickTime file that has a DV essence inside of it, a DV codec inside it, or you could have a QuickTime file that has a ProRes codec inside of it. It's important not to confuse wrappers with codecs. Codecs are the way the video has been encoded. A wrapper is how the file is presented in a computer file system, for example. So as we run down there, MXF, often referred to as the universal wrapper format, it was the thing that 8 years ago was meant to unify digital video in television. It was the thing that was meant to mean that material could be moved immediately from a QuickTime, from a Final Cut Pro into an Avid and off to a Thomson transmission server, and all manner of interconnectivity would be achieved. MXF really hasn't delivered very well on that, but it's still a widely used wrapper format for delivering video files. MPEG-2, that's a codec, and that's the codec that's used in HDV videotape, XDCAM, or some flavours of XDCAM. And then we've got DV, which has been around for a long time, and it's the codec that your little camera at home shoots onto when you're shooting onto tiny little DV videotapes. And in fact, starting as a domestic format in the mid-90s, it's extended pretty much into HD, and an awful lot of television is shot and made using DV-type codecs. Again, it's an iframe codec because it's they had their eye on editing when they designed it. So we've got a bit of a table here, which I don't think you probably can't even see it from there, but I stole it from Wikipedia, and it was really to illustrate that even though I've said that most editing systems, most transmission systems, are moving towards MPEG-4, H.264, those kind of things. Actually, if you look at contemporary systems, so this is a table that talks about Sony's XD-CAM formats. So XD-CAM has been with us for years now, and this just shows that depending on which model you bought in Sony's XD-CAM product line, you might be shooting on DV codec, you might be shooting MPEG-2, or you might be shooting MPEG-4. You might be shooting at a data rate from 18 megabits all the way through to 50 megabits per second. You might be shooting on sub-broadcast resolution, even quarter frame standard definition of 352 by 288, all the way up to 1920 by 1080 for high definition. And you might be using one of three different wrappers, MXF or AVI or QuickTime. So the point I'm trying to get to with this slide is that even though that's one product line from one manufacturer, there's still an awful lot of differences, and you have to be aware of those things if you're starting to plan maybe an editing workflow, or you're starting to plan a production from shooting through editing through delivery. Just saying to yourself, we'll stick with Sony, we'll shoot on XD-CAM, we'll edit this way, doesn't take away the requirement to think about what codec are we working with, how big are our video frames, and all those kind of things. And in fact, not only codecs, data rates, resolutions, wrappers, but also there's frame rates as well. You can shoot at many frame rates on XD-CAM. And that's probably true of all modern camera systems. They whether you're shooting onto removable disc or onto S/S card or SD card, you could well be shooting in any codec, in any wrapper type, and all those kind of things. So it's important that these things are considered before you plan your editing workflow. So there's just a picture there, again, stolen from Wikipedia, which is the source of all knowledge, of the various ways you can shoot if you're shooting with XD-CAM onto Blu-ray disc, Blu-ray professional removable disc, or S/S card, or latterly SD cards. So we'll take a bit of a break from all that codec and format and wrapper nonsense. And this is something that I get asked very often. 23.976 frames per second. What is all that about? About 10 years ago, Quantel used to publish a little fact book, and they suggested that 24 progressive frames per second really should be the lingua franca for modern television. That high definition television should always be shot that way, and then it can be pulled up to 30 frames per second, or it can be equally well suited for digital cinema, because films are shot at 24 frames per second, and with very little sort of speed adjustment, it can be useful in 25 frames per second, because that's how PAL works. Now, the thing to remember is that NTSC video is actually 29.97 frames per second. I know people often refer to NTSC as being 30 frames per second, because that's convenient, and it compares nicely to our 25 frames per second, but it's not. It's 29.97 frames per second for reasons that are very technical and very historical. Now, if you imagine you have to transfer 24 frame per second film, a cinema film for example, to videotape, there are two methods. In this country, we're entirely used to having our cinema films sped up a tiny bit and played out at 25 frames per second. So if you watch a film on television in this country, often it's about 4% shorter than it should be, because the film's been played a tiny bit fast. And in fact, people who are pitch perfect, people who can hear the difference between semitones of music and recognise them, they'll often say, well, I watched the film and the music was in a different key to when I saw it in the cinema. And in fact, some broadcasters even go to the trouble of pitch shifting it back down again. But 25 frames per second is the standard for television in this country, and it's convenient to be able to speed up 24 frame film and play it out at 25 frames per second. Now, if you live in America, NTSC has a slightly different issue. Their video, well, let's pretend it's 30 frames per second, just for an illustration. 24 frames per second sped up to 30 frames per second would be quite ridiculous. People's voices would sound noticeably higher, and the movie would be played out a lot quicker than it should be. So you can't really do that. So the Americans, since time immemorial, have used this method called the 3-2 pull down. And there's a little picture there to illustrate that. So the first column you can see there is if you imagine that they're frames of film, and they're going up A, B, C, D. They could be marked 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just to give you the impression that they're successive frames of the cinema film. Now, if you have to transfer those 4 frames of cinema film into 5 frames of video, which is what going from 24 to 30 requires, the little trick you do is by remembering that video is actually 2 interlaced fields per frame of video, you can do a very clever thing where you build the output frames of video based on fields, and you say, okay, the first frame of video, I'll take its first fields from the A frame of film and its second field from the A frame of film. So my first frame of video looks exactly like my first frame of film. You know, it's built entirely from the A frame. And then we've got the B frame, and similarly that's built into a complete B frame. But when we get to the C frame, we'll build one field from the B frame, i.e. the frame that preceded it, and the next field from the C frame, the one that we're on at the moment. And that will give us a frame that's a mix of the B, i.e. the second frame of film, and the C, i.e. the first frame of film. But because video plays out continuously, you don't actually notice it. It plays out correctly. And in fact, the next frame of video does the same trick again, except now it's built from a mix of the C frame and the D frame of the film. And then by the time we get to the 5th frame of video, we can build that entirely from the last frame of the film. So we've done this 3-2 pull down where we've managed to pull 24 frame film up to 30 frame video without having to resort to speeding the film up and hence losing the pitch of the music, etc. And if you just play the video, it looks okay. The problem is that some of those frames of video have now got a mix of 2 different frames of film, and so that's kind of hard for editing. You've now introduced frames of video that have been made up of 2 separate frames of film, and so it's kind of hard to edit those because you've got actually things changing within the frame of video, even though it's come from a progressive film which has no concept of fields. But for half a century, that's how the Americans did film on television. Every bit of film source material you ever saw that came from an NTSC source, that's how they did it. Now, NTSC's dirty little secret is that actually it's not 30 frames per second, it's 29.97 frames per second. And so you think, well, how on earth do I pull up 24 frames per second film to 29.9 frames per second video? That sounds very complicated mathematically. And so forever, NTSC telecine machines have actually internally worked at 23.976. So if you're pulling up from 24 to 30, the 3-2 pull down works. If you're pulling up to 29.97 frames per second, you've actually got to use something that's slightly slower than 24, and so the telecine machine in an NTSC facility actually internally runs at 23.976 frames per second. And that's an awful, frame rate to have to think about. But so the engineers who built telecine machines, it was kind of, well, it's how it works. And kind of when digital film production started to come along, when people started to shoot things on RED cameras and on Sony 950s and those kind of cameras, the assumption was that we could do away with all this nonsense, that 23976, that horrible vestige of our NTSC history could be done away with. But actually, an awful lot of things that are shot using a digital film workflow are shot so that they will wind up on NTSC television. So if, for example, you wanted to maintain a digital audio workflow all the way from the guy on set with his Sadie or whatever other location recorder he's using, if he wants to be able to maintain digital audio all the way through, actually you've got to now run the video camera at 23.976 so that you're not breaking those integer and non-integer frame rate boundaries by doing silly things further down the line. So 23.976 is with us, and it's actually become the mastering format of choice for most high-end digital workflow productions where there's an eye to that production winding up on television. So very important to be aware of 23.976. So just kind of wrapping things up and concluding, things were an awful lot simpler in the days of serial digital video at standard definition. We had fixed frame sizes. There were only 2 frame rates to ever consider: 25 frames per second for PAL and 29.97 for NTSC, and big expensive machines to convert between the two. We had many formats of videotape over the years, but they all worked within an SDI environment, that digital video 601 system. They all talk to each other. SDI is sometimes described as the lingua franca. It meant that all pieces of television equipment talk to each other. And pretty much all our video was uncompressed. It was as it came off the camera or out of the telecine machine. And there were a handful of compression codecs. But of course nowadays things are very different. Careful consideration is required. And if you're in a position where you're planning production, you're planning how you're going to shoot something, how it's subsequently going to be edited, and how it's going to be delivered to a broadcaster, you have to, pay attention to all those things, particularly, tables like that tell you all the possibilities there are with just one single manufacturer's format. And really that concludes things. So just really to sort of wrap that all up, kind of think about that kind of history of video, digital video, where that came from, why things are the way they are, computer graphics formats, editing versus transmission codecs, if you remember about that, the difference between iframe codecs, where only single frames compressed within the frame are used, against long GOP, where you can take advantage of the differences between video frames, all the way through to contemporary MPEG-4 codecs and the variations we have with those. But that's really, in conclusion, all the things I had for you today. As I say, this is a training taster for the longer training days that we do at Root6. Just up there is some of the other things we run that prove popular. TCP/IP for broadcast engineers. If you're an engineer or an operator, and all this networking stuff is kind of challenging, then that's a good one. Audio and Video 101, so an introduction to audio and video, very much for the runner who's going into the machine room, or the edit assistant who wants to kind of get a bit more clued up on audio and video. And Television QC 101, if you're suddenly find yourself in a position of responsibility of delivering finished material to a broadcaster, that's a very good place to start. If you want to download our notes for this week, the slides and other notes, the root6 blog, the address is there, root6.com/blog, and that contains lots of content from all of the engineers at Root6. We're constantly updating that and writing interesting articles about things we've come across. So if you've got a problem, you might well be able to find an answer to it on there. So just remain to say thank you very much, and if there's any questions, I'll throw it open to you now.